From InnovationOz.com, I'm James Riley. Welcome to the Commercial Disco. Join me on a voyage of commercial discovery, where we uncover great ideas in deep tech and research. The Commercial Disco is your window on the nation's business innovation landscape. I'm talking to the New South Wales Senator Dave Sharma, very well known to this industry. Senator Sharma is the new Shadow Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, and is a former ambassador to Israel, which is kind of how he got introduced to us and to this industry. Welcome, Senator.
Good morning, James. Great to join you.
Let's start. We don't need to dig through the entrails, but obviously it was a pretty tough election. You've just been appointed to your Shadow Assistant Minister role. What does the term look like to you? Where will you be putting your energies? There's obviously a few levers that can be pulled within the Treasury, and you're a man of ideas.
Yeah, well, look, I think our task is twofold as a party. One is to make sure we act as a credible opposition. You know, Australia is better off with a strong opposition, regardless of who's in government. It improves the quality of governance, and you need scrutiny of everything the government's doing. So our first task is to make sure we're doing the job we're there to do, which is to be an effective opposition. But look, the second task for us is a bit more of a soul-searching one, to be honest, and it's to reconnect our values and our principles with policies that speak to the priorities, needs, concerns and challenges that are facing Australia today. And I think, in a nutshell, that's really where we were lacking the last election, the last campaign. I don't think Australians saw us as having challenges or even a focus necessarily on some of the pressing issues that they face. And so I think a large part of what we'll need to be doing is a kind of, internally focused policy review, policy formulation process to make sure that we are actually a party that's relevant for contemporary Australia.
Can I ask you then, as someone who has shown a great deal of interest in the tech sector, in startups and all of that sort of thing that we love here, these things don't feature in general election campaigns. And I guess that's not terribly surprising, although to be completely absent in the conversation does strike me as a little odd. Is there something going on here in Australia that's out of step with, our contemporaries elsewhere in the world?
Look, I think, to be honest, there's a degree of complacency in Australia, which is born off, roughly speaking, 30 years of uninterrupted economic expansion since the early 90s recession, a huge windfall from resource and commodity exports, and a sense that, government didn't need to focus on challenges like productivity and economic reform and innovation because that stuff all looked after itself. Government was effectively about developing new social programs and redistributing national income. Now, I think we've already reached the end of that period, but government is slowly coming to terms with it. I mean, if you look at our economic performance over the last 3 years, it's pretty woeful. Productivity growth is the slowest it's been in 60 years. In real terms, people's living standards are going backwards. And what are we missing now? I mean, there is very little in the way of discussion about innovation, productivity, reform. And you touched on the startup sector there. I mean, how you get productivity is through innovation, is through new businesses starting, new technologies emerging and being embraced by existing and new businesses, industries being disrupted by new challenges. That's how processes improve in our market economic system. And there has been too little of that in Australia. So I'm keen to talk more about early stage innovation economy, if you like, as a way to help get the productivity cycle moving again in Australia.
Okay, let's talk about one area that's definitely in your new portfolio. That would be on the changes to treatment of superannuation tax. And there is the treatment of the taxation of unrealised gains and its impact or potential impact on investment in very early stage startups. Is that a real problem? How do you view that?
Yeah, I think it's a massive problem. So, you can have arguments about, in sort of tax purist terms, about whether you should be taxing unrealised gains or not and what the right balance should be in superannuation accounts before you apply another levy of tax. But the thing I'm most interested in and concerned about is what it will do to the availability of patient, early stage, risk-oriented capital that is prepared to take a bet and invest in early stage businesses that have uncertain prospects, that might deliver a great return, might go to zero, but are unlikely to reach any sort of liquidity event for sort of 5 to 10 years. So if you're an investor and you give an early stage company in a Series A or a seed round $100,000, say, it might be that company raises 5 times the valuation you invested in a few years' time. So then notionally you've had a 5x gain, right? And you will need to pay tax on that if you've invested out of your self-managed superannuation fund. But we all know, anyone who's been in this industry know that just because they've had an up round doesn't mean that the business won't go to zero in a few years' time. It doesn't mean that you'll be able to get the money out or realise your gains anytime soon. And so what this will effectively do is drain the pool of available capital that goes into these businesses, because suddenly people are going to have to incur a tax liability and pay a tax bill on a gain that's theoretical only and that might never materialise or might not release any capital to allow you to pay that bill. So I think this is a terrible thing for our sector, and it's particularly true given that general attitude and the availability of capital towards this sector is one of our biggest constraints in Australia.
Okay, let me ask you this. Being a shadow assistant in Treasury, it sort of gives you quite a license to roam, doesn't it? Because Treasury has an impact on so many policy areas. For example, at the press club the other day, Nobel laureate Brian Schmidt and economist Richard Holden were talking about the needed structural reform to research to enable our sovereign research capability. But there would be any number of other examples where Treasury is hugely important to the policy discussion. Where will you focus yourself?
Well, look, I think it is a broad remit. I intend to take an extensive interpretation to it. I mean, I think the portfolio, covering as it does, competition, Treasury and charities as well, it covers all the sort of manner of economic activity in Australia. But where I see the challenge in a nutshell is, how do we get productivity growing again in Australia? How do we have people producing more with less? Because ultimately, the driver of higher living standards and a larger economy which can fund generous social services is productivity growth. And the Productivity Commission said just last week that 80% of our growth in national income over the last 30 years has come from productivity growth. The rest is kind of a terms of trade, windfalls from commodity price booms and whatnot. But, so if you don't have productivity moving, the economy is not getting any larger, people's living standards aren't improving, and the availability of public money for essential social services is constrained, whether that's, aged care, whether it's disability care, whether it's the need to increase our defence force. So I intend to use the portfolio to kind of examine everything that is at the heart of our productivity challenge and understand why business confidence is so low, why businesses are largely not investing in Australia. Those are all massive concerns, and they're storing up problems for ourselves as a nation, but also for our people.
Okay, I want to talk to you about the big wave of change that's on its way with artificial intelligence across all industry sectors. But before I do, let me ask you, we sort of became engaged in setting up this conversation. We were talking about some misinformation, disinformation themes. I think you were in the US earlier in the year President Trump was about to be inaugurated, I think.
That's right, yeah.
So let me ask you this. I mean, there's been a dramatic increase in big tech influence in the US. The power of these platforms is well recognised, well talked about. I want to ask you what you saw in the US, and then how do we, as a sovereign nation that we are, how does a country like Australia try and govern platforms like this that are so large, powerful, and controlled elsewhere?
Look, it's one of the big policy challenges of the age. I was in the US earlier in the year. I spent some time in Seattle with Amazon and Microsoft, and spent some time in San Francisco with Google and at Stanford University, where largely artificial intelligence was all anyone wanted to talk about, with good reason, given its potential impact on every sphere of human activity and its potential enabling effect. I think Australia needs to recognise, obviously, that we are part of a global economy, and yes, we can exercise national sovereignty, and yes, we should take our own policy approaches, but we also need to recognise that we are competing with other jurisdictions, the United States, Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, to attract new industries, to generate inwards investment, to produce goods more efficiently. And we cannot afford to ignore that competitive dynamic. So we need to watch what's happening around the world elsewhere. We need to coordinate where we can through bodies like the G20 and through bodies like the OECD, which have similar economic profiles and structures and similar needs. But we can't pretend that we're an island nation, in the sort of technological sense, even if we might be geographically. We can't cut ourselves off from these changes. And one of my concerns about where the debate around artificial intelligence in Australia seems to be heading under this government is that if we take too risk-averse an approach, or if we think we're going to cut ourselves off from this and let the rest of the world experiment with it, and then we'll see how it all ends up, then we will be left behind. And that will be to the detriment of, not just certain sectors and industries and workplaces, but to the detriment of us nationally.
Yeah, I mean, in the last term of government, I think there was quite a focus on risk as opposed to reward, I suppose. Let me ask you, there is a wave of artificial intelligence coming, as you say, across all sectors. Yesterday, our new Industry and Innovation Minister, Tim Ayres, your colleague, he wants unions to be more involved or more say in how AI is implemented in the workplace. You had some criticisms on that.
I did. I think that's entirely the wrong approach to be taking. I mean, I think, yes, of course, workers will be intimately involved in the use and deployment of AI in the workplace. I mean, if AI is to be a success, workers will need to be part of that journey. But the idea that trade unions, that trade unions are there to represent a particular sector of the population and a particular part of the business enterprise, and I have no quibble with that role. But the idea that they should be allowed to effectively exercise a veto or constrain the use of AI in a workplace, I think is an incredibly retrograde step and will put Australia at the back of the pack. I mean, I think we don't know yet how artificial intelligence will transform certain sectors and industries. And in some areas, it will have quite a big impact. In others, it will be small. But, what we will need to be able to do in Australia is experiment and iterate and test and refine and moderate. And we will find that, like many new technologies, just because they exist, it doesn't sort of transform the way the business is done. What needs to happen is workers need to learn how to use them. Business systems and processes need to be re-engineered around the new technology. And then sort of new methodologies and new ways of doing business will need to emerge. And all that will take time, and we'll need to take a relatively liberal, in the small L sense, liberal approach to the use of this technology. So the idea that we need to sort of completely game something out before we allow this experimentation and innovation to happen, and that we need to account for and identify any number of potential risks, I think it's just a recipe for stasis and inaction. And I think that's what concerns me. I mean, we know that the trade unions are a big presence in this Labor government. They were able to engineer quite massive changes to the industrial relations system in a way that benefited trade unions in the first term of this Labor government. I'm concerned they're going to try and do the same thing with artificial intelligence and just basically make it a no-go zone for Australian businesses.
So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit. I'm interested in the conversations that you had when you're in Seattle and when you're in San Francisco, kind of two of the epicenters of development in this industry. Describe a conversation that you have there and a conversation that you have in Australia. Are we talking about the same things?
I don't think we in Australia understand just quite how quickly this technology is moving. So one of the figures that stuck with me from a professor at Stanford, he talked about the time taken for technology to reach 1/3 penetration of the population, right? For 1/3 of the population to be embracing and using this new technology. So in the United States, that's 100 million people. The population's 300 million. So electricity, for instance, it took 45 years from when electricity was invented for 1/3 of the population to be using it. A telephone was 35 years. TVs were 25 years. Cell phones, 13 years. Internet, which we think of as ubiquitous today, took 7 years for 1/3 of the population to be using that. ChatGPT took 60 days. 2 months for 1/3 of the population to be using it. So that's happening orders of magnitude more quickly in terms of the uptake and embrace of new technology than we've seen before. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's using ChatGPT every day or they've integrated it into their lives or anything else like that. But it shows that the cycle of this is moving very quickly. And any of us who have children who are at school know that children are using this all the time. I mean, I use it to help my kids with their homework when they come to me with a maths problem and I don't remember how to do the integration of this or, solve a quadratic equation anymore. I'll use ChatGPT or a similar thing to give me the answer. So this is moving a lot more quickly, I think, than people realise. And there's already a lot of anecdotal evidence that even in businesses that do not even have an AI policy, right? It's not integrated into their systems. Workers are using AI all the time to help them with their job because they recognize it's a productivity enhancer. It's a tool that allows them to do the job more quickly. So, we need to get to grips with that and realize that in many respects, the horse is already bolted and we shouldn't be trying to shut the barn doors now.
So I'll start drawing it to a close now, but on that, I know it's slightly fatuous to say, like everyone says government should do more. Of course, there's always things that we can do more of. But in relation to AI, there's a global war for talent. There's huge competition for NVIDIA chips. There's competition among nations to attract data centers, all this kind of AI infrastructure. You're looking at this landscape, you're back from the US having talked to these people. How can Australia most efficiently and quickly enable our capability?
I would think that our traditional strengths as sort of a magnet for talent and attractiveness of investment has tended to be a regulatory setting that's favourable and, strong rule of law and political stability. Those tend to be our enduring assets. We're not going to spend, and there's no tradition of us spending billions or trillions of dollars to try and establish an industry, from the beginning. We're not that sort of economy and we don't run that sort of economy. So what I think we need to focus on is our, regulatory settings and attitudinal settings. And this is an area where traditionally it's been a strength of Australia's, but we risk getting it badly wrong here if we take an overly conservative or risk-averse approach to this new technology. If we throw up a whole lot of barriers, if we say that before a business can use AI, they need to consult with the trade union and it becomes part of the next round of enterprise agreements, even if we set up a dynamic that workers and business are somehow on opposite sides of this AI equation, that it's a zero-sum proposition. I mean, all the evidence of past technological change is that workers benefit as much as the business from the deployment of new technology because it allows them to do their job more efficiently. It often removes them from routine, repetitive tasks and allows them to focus on higher level, more conceptually challenging and more intellectually interesting work. So, we need to be embracing that. And I think the best thing the government can do is not stymie this with red tape and regulation and bureaucracy. I think that's the main challenge we face.
All right, Senator Dave Sharma, thanks very much for coming on the Commercial Disco. We look forward to talking to you again.
Look forward to keeping the conversation going, James. Thanks for having me on.